The wartime experiences of Indigenous Anzacs are dimly recorded in Australia's history and collective memory. Before the First World War, Aboriginal people had no official status as Australian citizens. Unable to vote and with very limited rights, they were also exempt from serving in the military. But when war broke out, Aboriginal men answered the call for volunteers and joined the lines at their nearest recruitment centres. The official position of the military in 1914 was to reject any man who was not substantially of European origin or descent. As a result, most Indigenous volunteers were turned away on the grounds of their race. To circumvent this rule, many candidates would conceal their background during the enlistment process, citing instead Maori or Indian heritage. Those rejected by their local recruitment centre might travel hundreds of miles to a different enlistment depot to go through the vetting process again. Some men travelled to 4 or 5 centres before succeeding in their goal of enlistment. In some cases, it was common for groups of men from the same communities to sign on together. 5 brothers from the Lovett family of Victoria enlisted during the war, all of whom would survive to return home again. 3 brothers from Queensland, Alfred, Charles and Thomas Blackman, signed up and fought in the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. Private Alfred Blackman later died from his wounds in France. Despite the obstacles put in front of them, it's estimated that up to 1,300 Indigenous men served in the Australian Imperial Force during the First World War, although that number is likely to be higher. Of those, around 250 to 300 men were killed in service. Wartime offered Indigenous men a fraternity they had not previously experienced. But this equality and inclusion lasted only as long as the war. On returning to their homeland, the social status of Aboriginal soldiers was again reduced to that of second-class citizens. With the familiar obstacles and prejudices to immediately greet them, they experienced a very different homecoming to other Australian servicemen. In the years after the war, Indigenous veterans found they were denied the same entitlements as white Australian veterans, and many would have their war traumas compounded by government policies that imposed restrictions on their lives and those of their families. Some Indigenous servicemen returned home to find their children had been taken away, or their families had been forcibly relocated from their land. By the 1920s, Indigenous veterans of the First World War were calling for an end to discrimination and began to assert their rights for equality and citizenship. A well-organised political movement began to form, made up of the many disillusioned veterans who felt their service and sacrifice had been ignored. One Aboriginal ex-serviceman, Douglas Grant, became a well-known voice in the call for justice. Private Grant, who was wounded at Bullecourt in 1917 and spent nearly 2 years in German prison camps, went on to become an advocate for the civil rights of Aboriginal people. In his later years, Grant voiced his hopes for the Australian Aboriginal in an interview.
Australia is the Aboriginals by birth, the Australians by adoption. The too amenable, too easily pleased Aboriginal did not realise the significance of what he was doing in signing away his land. Surely, after 150 years, the government can see its way clear to uplift and emancipate the Australian Aboriginal.
Why Indigenous Australians volunteered to fight for a nation which afforded them so few rights and subjected them to so many prejudices can seem hard to comprehend. But in all likelihood, it was for the same reasons as non-Indigenous Australians. Many may have seen their service as a decent job for a decent wage and a chance to follow their brothers and mates on a grand, unimaginable adventure. At the same time, it would have been entirely reasonable to have expected their war service would advance their rights and opportunities when they returned home. A deep love of country and the call of duty would also have been strong motivations at the time. A testament to this sense of duty is best understood in the decision by some Indigenous veterans of the First War who chose to serve again in the Second. Private Thomas Blackman captured the shared experience of Indigenous servicemen in the aftermath of the war. "We were good men at war, but looked down on now the war is over." Although the nations of the Allied and Central Powers were opposed in ideological and physical conflict, their civilian population shared very similar experiences: dramatic declines in standards of living, devastating personal losses, and a suspension of normal life for the long years of the war. Looking back, it can be difficult to comprehend how the majorities of these populations appeared to continue to support the war in spite of the terrible price being paid on all sides. One of the most successful methods employed by governments on the home front in their attempts to manipulate mass opinion in support of the war was the propaganda poster. This bold, semiotic medium manipulated the emotional and intellectual life of civilian populations at a glance, stirring hearts and inspiring minds. Powerful images and key phrases would stay with people long after they had moved on. Catchphrases crystallized into beliefs, and the powerful visuals evoked strong emotions instilled in people's memories. From enlistment campaigns to dramatic reminders of the need for vigilance and selfless dedication to the greater cause, these potent images relayed manipulative narratives that worked on many levels. The best examples of this art of manipulation were also remarkable feats in graphic design, ingenious artistry, conveying the aesthetic hallmarks of the age, as well as a range of righteous and invidious messages. Throughout the years of the war, no other form of mass communication had as profound an effect on normal people than the abundance of propaganda posters. These singular images were visible throughout everyday life, and although there were many varieties of designs, they all shared a similar intent: the bending of the public will to unity in the support of war. The tone of a poster frequently defined its degree of success. Messages that instilled collective pride, comradeship, and a degree of positivity, even humour, were frequently more successful than those questioning an individual's moral integrity or emphasising desperation, guilt, or a loss of hope. In enrolment posters, the positive appearance of a smiling soldier would prove more effective than one depicting suffering and the dire realities of the front. Self-deprecating humour, irony, and a light touch were often the messages that remained memorable among the civilian populations. But there were also plenty of examples that evoked the dark and dreadful aspects of war, messages that ranged from a close alignment to reality through to sheer hyperbole. At the outbreak of war, following Britain's lead, the Australian government realised it would need to employ artists and copywriters in the production of posters that would appeal to the nation's sensibilities. An advertisement in 1915 called for artists and writers who could produce posters that would decorate stations, streets and hotels with bold productions, appealing for more men in the fighting line. One of Australia's most successful poster artists was Norman Lindsay. Lindsay worked in many mediums, as an etcher, sculptor, writer, editorial cartoonist and painter, and worked commercially at the Sydney Bulletin magazine as a staff artist at various intervals between 1901 and 1958. During the war, he produced jingoistic cartoons alongside a range of pro-conscription posters. In the wake of the Australian public's votes against compulsory conscription, Lindsay was commissioned to produce a recruitment kit. Guided by the concepts of persuasion, fear and guilt, his poster, "Today the German monster threatens the world with bloodshed, slavery and death" from 1917, depicts a maniacal German ogre threatening the world. The artful legacy of propaganda posters from the First World War endures today as an evocative reminder of the ideological and manipulative intentions of governments across the world as they fought a war of ideas on the home front, struggling to keep their civilian populations aligned with the reasons for conflict and endure levels of suffering and loss never before witnessed in human history.